IJM, our work is focused on engaging public justice system actors in the developing world. We are a team of lawyers, investigators, social workers, and other professionals who are inspired by our Christian faith and God's call to seek justice for people in oppression. We are motivated by that faith to take action and to seek justice. Our teams work with local authorities to rescue individual victims of violence and restore survivors to safety and stability. So we collaborate with justice system and community leaders to respond to violence, and together with those actors, we design improvements that can help deter criminals, serve survivors, and drastically decrease violence. A similar dynamic that you may be familiar with, but I just want to start by sharing, is the reality of modern day slavery, also known as human trafficking. Those terms are synonymous in our world today. The most recent data from the Walk Free Foundation, the International Labor Organization, and the International Organization on Migration that came out last fall indicated that over 50 million people in the year 2022 were victims of modern slavery. 50 million people. To give you a sense of the scale and even the increase that we are seeing in this kind of violence, the most recent estimate prior to 2022 was conducted in 2016, and the number was about 40 million victims at that time. So in the intervening years, about 10 million more people are expected to have been victimized in this way, either in sex trafficking or labor trafficking. A couple of other data points. It's estimated that about $150 billion annually is generated in illicit profits through modern slavery. A big chunk of that, about 2/3, coming from commercial sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. And then lastly, 1 in 4 victims, according to that most recent research that came out December 2022 that showed 50 million victims, 1 in 4 of those victims is a child. 25% of global modern slavery victims are children. And it can be really challenging in the face of statistics like these to determine, how can I, as an individual person, make a difference for millions of people who are trapped in slavery and exploitation? How can I try to protect or to rescue the millions of children at this moment who are victims of modern slavery? And the sad reality is that you can't. You cannot, I cannot. The problem of violence against the poor and modern slavery in particular is so big and so huge that no individual alone can stop it. No organization alone, not even IJM, can stop it either. It's a problem that's too big for me or you or even IJM. And so the question that I come to upon that realization is, what do we need to do from here? What do we need to do to try to address this massive global problem? And at IJM, we think that this problem can only be solved through a movement. And so that is what we are trying to do in part, is mobilize a movement. Now, what do we need to build a movement? First, we need a lot of people, right? We need people from all walks of life. Some people in this movement are students like yourselves. Some people are retirees. Some people are researchers. Other people are advocates. Some people in the movement will be interns. Some people will be full-time staff. The bigger the kind of change that we're trying to create, the bigger the movement needs to be. So the first thing we need is a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds with different skills and in different stages of life. Secondly, we need a shared vision. We need to be united by our cause. The problem that we're trying to solve needs to bind us together. We need to be in agreement that change is actually possible. We need to share a conviction that something is wrong in the world, but we believe we can do something about it. So in our case, it is the problem of everyday violence and modern slavery. That's the problem that unites us, and we are trying to mobilize people towards this shared vision. Now, when I first heard the term mobilize, I thought to myself, what actually does that mean? What are some other words, some synonyms for the word mobilize? So if you are thinking similarly, here's a couple of terms to kind of get your brain moving about what it means to mobilize. It means to deploy, to muster, to rally, to call up or to assemble, to organize, to prepare, to generate, to arouse, to awaken, to excite, to incite, to provoke, to prompt, to stimulate, to stir up, to galvanize, to encourage, to inspire. But to do what? To what ends? This picture may be familiar to you. It was taken on August 28th, 1963. And on that day, over 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial to bear witness to one of the greatest speeches in American history. And I'd like to share a little bit of that message today with you that they heard. Starting here with this quote, "In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. The note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. There is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children." Now, you may have even heard this excerpt before from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. This speech is considered by many historians to be a turning point in the civil rights movement. For hundreds of years, African Americans in this country had been fighting for equal rights. And on this date, with hundreds of thousands gathered in person and millions more watching on TV, King rallied the world to the cause and to this vision. Just less than a year later, the following year on July 2nd, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, making discrimination in schools, workplaces, and public facilities illegal. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed. Change was happening. The movement was working, much of which was the result of King's "I Have a Dream" speech. But that speech wasn't the movement, it was a moment. Because movements really are the culmination of hundreds, if not thousands, of moments. And you add all of these moments together, and eventually you get a movement. King's speech was this critical moment that you and I have all heard of. But even that moment was the result of hundreds of other moments done by other people you most likely never have heard of. Without the work of so many, King's moment just would not have happened. A movement happens when individual people do what they can with what they have. And this is one of those people. This is Bayard Rustin. He managed mobilization and logistics for the March on Washington. Rustin built and led a team of over 200 activists and organizers who publicized and recruited marchers, coordinated buses and trains, provided marshals, and arranged all sorts of other logistics. He rented space in Harlem for $165, and he had only 2 months to plan and execute the March on Washington. He and his team raised the equivalent of $1 million in today's currency. This is Joyce Ladner, another name you've probably never heard before. Joyce was one of Rustin's 200 volunteers. She was a junior at Tougaloo College in Mississippi, and she was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. She traveled to Harlem in the summer of 1963, and she worked for Rustin at the March headquarters. She shared a one-bedroom apartment with 3 other girls, and Joyce often had to wait for Bob Dylan to stop playing guitar on the couch before she could claim her bed. It happened that Dylan was friends of one of her roommates and would actually be a future performer at the March on Washington. Joyce worked for 18-hour days, 6 days a week, for 8 weeks in preparation for the event, helping coordinate logistics for hundreds of thousands of people to attend. So Rustin and his team, all told, marshaled more than 2,200 chartered buses, 40 special trains, 22 first aid stations, 8 2,500-gallon water storage tank trucks, and 21 portable water fountains. And just imagine trying to get the word out to hundreds of thousands of people, trying to get them to come to Washington before email and before social media. On the day of the march, 900 charter buses were rented from New York alone, and over 100 buses were arriving in DC every hour, this massive movement of people. And then there were the hundreds of volunteers that worked for hours, preparing tens of thousands of 50-cent box lunches, consisting of a cheese sandwich, a slice of pound cake, and an apple. 80,000 cheese sandwiches. That was their contribution to this historic movement. And this is Ledger Smith, one more individual who I want to introduce you to from our research. He was, at the time, 27 years old, and he was a truck driver who lived at 3835 Federal Street in Chicago. And Ledger wanted to help spread the word about the march and mobilize and inspire others to support it. So he left his home on August 17th, 1963, leaving down Michigan Avenue in Chicago. He made his way through South Bend and Fort Wayne, Indiana, to Lima, Columbus, and Zanesville, Ohio, Wheeling, West Virginia, to Pittsburgh, and then Uniontown, Pennsylvania. And then finally he cut through Hagerstown and Frederick, Maryland, before at last arriving in Washington, D.C. on August 27th. You saw it in the previous photo, but he wore this big red sash that had the word freedom written on it for anyone who encountered him to see. Now, what makes Ledger's journey remarkable is that he didn't drive to Washington. He didn't fly. He didn't take a bus. He roller skated the entire 685 miles and garnered a national spotlight for the march. After weeks of training and being clocked at speeds of 25 miles an hour, Ledger created a moment in this larger movement. Followed by friends in a car and with food and extra supplies, including 3 sets of extra wheels, Ledger arrived safely, even after repeated attempts by white supremacists to run him off the road. He arrived to a cheering crowd, about 20 pounds lighter, and Ledger said, "Not much." He said, "I think my legs have done enough talking." He did what he could with what he had, inviting people and inspiring others to come along. These moments are what matters. Without the moments, there is no movement. And without research, these moments are not often known. The details and the depth that goes into large social change often isn't well understood without research to properly document it. And this is what makes the moment that we are in so crucial. There's this temptation when you're facing a large social injustice like modern day slavery or like racial injustice to say, well, they're just blank moments. They're just making sandwiches. They're just printing flyers. They're just renting buses. They're just roller skating even. They're just moments. But you add up those just moments and you get a movement. History is changed by people who don't feel like they're changing it in the moment. This is what we are trying to do at IJM. We are trying to mobilize a movement of people who are willing to do what they can with what they have. And the reality is that we all have a part to play. A few of us, a small number of us, will give I Have a Dream speeches. That's the name that everyone will know. Some of us will roller skate. A lot of us are going to need to make sandwiches. And all of us can do something. At IJM, this means some will answer the phone. Some will design a website. Some will conduct research. Some will turn that research into reports and memorandums. Some will go undercover to rescue that girl trapped in a brothel. Done in isolation, these moments don't make much of a difference. But when they're done in coordination and united in shared vision and common goal, these moments together become a movement. Now, I share this history with you tonight to illustrate the power of research in our advocacy work. At IJM, we know that an essential component of advocacy is gathering the data, the facts, and the narrative to move an audience or a powerful person to action. And research is one of the most powerful tools in our toolbox to do just that. I will tell you, without the time-consuming research from my colleagues to gather these details, the stories of Ledger Smith and Joyce Ladner and Bayard Rustin, a present-day audience like yourselves might miss the details and the immense level of effort that was put forth to make the March on Washington a success. Research can produce the details, the data, and the depth to make an argument with great power. I also chose to share this particular illustration from the American Civil Rights Movement with you One, because of the power it had in a place like Washington, where I spend my days, and I try to attract the attention and the interest of lawmakers on the issues that we focus on. But I also share it with you because of the historical context here, the way that during the civil rights movement, the Christian faith of so many individual leaders and actors informed the vision of many who were active in the civil rights movement. You heard it in the excerpt of Dr. King's speech that I shared earlier. At IJM, we are similarly motivated by our faith, the call to seek justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. That animates our work to strengthen public justice systems for the benefit of all people, especially the most vulnerable. We also believe that as God's people, we have roles to play in protecting people in poverty from violence. God has also given rulers, authorities, their power and authority with the responsibility to protect those who are most vulnerable under their care. And we see this in many places throughout Scripture when rulers haven't used their power to this good end or have actually been complicit even in violence. God has raised up his people to call these rulers back to justice. Think of the prophet Nathan, for example, calling King David to account for his role in the killing of Bathsheba's husband. We believe that at IJM, as God's people, we all have a role to play in this work of protecting people who are vulnerable to violence from that violence. We all have a part to play. You, as researchers, as advocates, as students, are a part of that movement. And we think a movement is that which brings the change we need. Now, I'm also pleased to tell you that this movement that IJM has been at work forming for the last 25 years to protect people from slavery and violence globally is picking up steam. We are seeing that change is possible. We have learned from our work over these last 2 decades plus that when laws are effectively enforced, people in poverty are protected. And we're seeing this pattern of transformation scale globally. At IJM, to build communities where people are safe and protected and can have the expectation that they're safe and protected, we are working to strengthen justice systems. We collaborate with justice system and community leaders, as I mentioned earlier. We, of course, rescue and restore victims. We partner with local authorities to bring individual people out of situations of violence and help restore them to lives of safety and stability. We also are working to hold criminals accountable. We are bringing those who would abuse the vulnerable to justice, alongside justice system officials like prosecutors, to stop the cycle of violence and deter others from abusing vulnerable people. And lastly, we are working to scale the demand for protection. We convene and equip champions to advocate for protection as an essential and tangible future for everyone. This is a sense of our global footprint today. We are a global team, as I mentioned, working from across 27 countries, 40 offices currently, and we've spent more than 25 years on the front lines. I'm happy to come back to this slide during Q&A if you have questions about the particular countries where IJM is working. Together over that period, 25 years, we have brought more than 85,000 people experiencing violence and oppression to freedom and safety. And we have worked to convict more than 5,700 criminals in local courts, ensuring that they cannot abuse others. But because of the power of deterrence, we've also seen broader transformation in entire communities as these systems start to protect children, women, and men right from the start, ensuring that those who might have been vulnerable to violence before never are under that threat. Now we're pursuing this big, audacious goal. We have a goal that by the year 2030, We aim to see 500 million people, children, women, and men, protected from violence. We are determined to see a future where those living in communities that IJM has worked in for so many years can count on the protection of the law and strong justice systems where they can expect to be safe. IJM doesn't just rescue individual people who have been abused, because the goal is to prevent violence from happening in the first place. We want to stop it at its source. We've seen over and over again that when criminals fear being caught, when they actually face consequences under the law, when perpetrators go to jail, when law enforcement doesn't tolerate violence, when justice systems stand up for the good of survivors, many criminals choose to stop. They just won't risk committing violence. This kind of deterrent effect leads to violence being dramatically reduced, and vulnerable people are protected in places where it was once common. And so this is why IJM, alongside our partners and justice system officials, are pursuing sustainable improvement and developments in the justice system. Because that's how we believe you protect 500 million people from ever experiencing violence in the first place. Now, as I close, I do want to include an opportunity for you to join with us at IJM, even tonight or later this week. I would be remiss if, as Congressional Affairs Director, I didn't include a way for you to engage your members of Congress here. So I would encourage you to take a look at this link, ijm.org/action-center, where you can sign a petition encouraging your members of Congress to prioritize funding in the federal budget for the year 2024 that addresses trafficking and slavery. We have pre-written a message for you. You'll go to the link, you click on the first campaign you see, and it'll take you just a minute or two to send a message to your elected officials. And of course, in the world of advocacy and of mobilization, I would encourage you to not only take a look and sign it yourself, but share it with some friends, mobilize others to take action as well. And with that, I'm going to pause, and I'm glad to take any questions